Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Amanda Bradbury. I'm an assistant professor of equine science at Montana State University in the Department of Animal and Range Science, and I'm also a consulting nutritionist for FullBucket Health. And I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about spring grasses and what spring grass means from a horse management perspective, why we may have some concerns associated with it and may need to adjust our management techniques during those spring months to keep our horses safe metabolically and nutritionally. So just to begin, Turnout on pasture is a great management program. I'm always an advocate of turning horses out because it allows them voluntary exercise, it can meet their nutrient requirements for maintenance, but also has a great behavioral aspect in minimizing vices. So for example, the voluntary exercise associated with turnout is great for maintaining bone structural integrity, joint integrity and health, muscle mass, preventing atrophy when a horse is left in a stall the majority of time and may not have a lot of exercise available. From a nutrition perspective, we can meet the majority of our horse's nutrient requirements on forage alone when they're not in heavy exercise or not in late gestation or lactation. So it's a nice and relatively inexpensive means of providing nutrition to that horse. And the amount of fiber in our grasses is really healthy for the GI. Our horses have a requirement for long stem forage, and that should be the base of any horse's diet. So it helps out with with GI health. And I think of those long stem forages kind of like a broom going through the GI tract and sweeping out all the bad things and cleaning things out and maintaining it for everything else to come through there. So pasture is a great way to do that, and without having to supplement hay, which can become quite costly. It also satisfies just innate grazing behavior. The way a horse's GI is set up is that it is meant to constantly have long stem forage coming in and constantly be working on that. So having horses on pasture satisfies that innate grazing behavior that is needed to maintain GI health. And then from a behavioral aspect, when a horse is turned out on pasture, they typically don't have a reason to be bored. Horses get bored when they're without that innate grazing behavior, and oftentimes in a confinement setting, we have a hard time mimicking that innate grazing behavior. So having horses out on pasture can certainly minimize vices, which most often come about during a nutrient deficiency or just simple boredom. Horses will find things to chew on, which will turn into wood chewing. They'll pace in the stall, they'll walk hot laps in the stall and dig holes for you. Even as far as into cribbing, where horses actually take in air into their esophagus, which ultimately results in an endorphin release. But if we turn horses out on pasture, we typically don't see those vices present themselves, so it's a nice preventative mechanism for that. But unfortunately, there are risks associated with horses being managed in a pasture setting during spring months, particularly when that pasture is filled with cool season grasses. And our horses that are of greatest risk are horses that already have metabolic disorders. So those that have insulin resistance, equine metabolic syndrome, Cushing's disease, or PPID, whichever way you want to know that, but they're the same. PPID and Cushing's are the same disease. Also just general digestive disturbances, chronic laminitis, and so on. Those are our horses of greatest risk during the spring months. But our horses that are just obese, or just your average horse can still have some risks associated with being turned out on pasture during the spring months. Now, this is not a reason for you to change how you house your horse and put them in a confinement setting. It's just some things that we need to think about from a management perspective in the spring months where the risks are greatest. So what happens to make cool season grasses in the spring a little bit risky? Well, basically, cool season grasses that had been dormant in the winter months are starting into their active period of their growth stages. And so they're incredibly active during this early growth stage. So they're photosynthesizing at a very rapid rate. The purpose of photosynthesis in plants, including grasses, is to produce nutrients for the plant. And a lot of those nutrients are in the form of non-structural carbohydrates, which are our starches, sugars, and fructans. So as these grasses come out of their period of dormancy and become very active in the early growth stage, photosynthesis becomes very active and very rapid. And so what that does is it increases the amount of nutrients that are being produced and stored for that plant in the form of non-structural carbohydrates. And cool season grasses, much more so than warm season grasses, have this innate ability to store really high concentrations of these non-structural carbohydrates, which is great for the plant, not so great for our horses that are consuming the plant. So what do we worry about? Well, in order to know what we're worried about and why, we have to understand how those non-structural carbohydrates are digested and used by the horse. So there's two ways starches or non-structural carbohydrates can be digested by the horse. Ideally, they're going to be digested and absorbed in the foregut or in the stomach and small intestine, which is kind of the front half of the system. And so our goal is for it to be digested there. And when it is, it's absorbed in the form of glucose. Now, the problem with this in some of our horses, and these are horses with current metabolic diseases, is that glucose is absorbed and blood glucose levels increase. Well, when blood glucose levels increase, the pancreas releases insulin in response. And what that insulin does is it goes to the tissues, particularly muscle and liver, and tells those tissues to bring in glucose and then store that glucose for later use for energy. Now, this is great for our high-performing horses that spend a lot of time in anaerobic exercise, but in our horses with metabolic diseases or that are at greater risk of metabolic diseases because of obesity or something like that, the problem is insulin keeps being released to try to reduce the glucose levels. And in doing so, the tissues start to ignore the insulin. So it's kind of like the annoying little brother that comes and pokes at you and you just start to ignore, right? That's what the muscle and the liver starts doing to insulin. And that's where we get to a state of insulin resistance and equine metabolic syndrome, is when those tissues lose the ability to respond to that insulin and take in glucose. So in the cool season, grasses during spring months, when we see an increase in those non-structural carbohydrates, we're going to see blood glucose rise following that consumption, but insulin can no longer do anything about it. And that can cause any number of metabolic issues, gastrointestinal disturbances, and so on. So that's our first concern. The second concern is we put so much non-structural carbohydrates, starches, and sugars into the gastrointestinal system, and unfortunately the foregut can't keep up. It can't digest all of them, can't cause absorption of all of them. So what happens are those non-structural carbohydrates actually end up being pushed towards the horse's hindgut. Well, the horse's hindgut, which is their cecum and colon, has a huge capacity for fermentation because it houses billions and billions of microbes, which is also known as the gut microbiome. But these gut microbial populations are responsible for fermenting all of the nutrients that aren't digested and absorbed in the foregut. And so when they ferment, they release other products that can be used by the horse. Now, the problem with a lot of non-structural carbohydrates making it to the hindgut in the form, again, of starches and sugars is that those starches and sugars are easily digestible by the microbes. So they rapidly ferment. And when they do, a certain grouping of microbes really thrives. And those are our amylolytic bacteria. And when they are thriving, the pH in the GI goes down. And when the pH goes down, that causes some of our other good microbes to die off, particularly our cellulolytic microbes. Now, when those cellulolytic microbes die, a whole swarm of events happen. You lose the integrity of the lining of the gastrointestinal system, endotoxins are released that can enter into the bloodstream, and ultimately that's going to result in what we know as laminitis, which is breakdown of the lamina of the hoof. Now, there are a lot of different steps in that process, and don't worry about those. But just understand that when a lot of starches and sugars make it to the hindgut of that horse, that's the greatest risk for us is a laminitis type situation. Because the pH is dropping, endotoxins are being absorbed, bad things happen. So we want to control the amount of non-structural carbohydrates that a horse consumes at any given time. And ultimately, that's the best way to prevent the negative effects of the levels of non-structural carbohydrates that present themselves in our cool season grasses during the spring months. So how do we do that? Basically, we do that through our various different management practices. So we'll talk about our high-risk horses and our horses that are a little bit less at risk for these things. The problem with these cool season grasses being so active in the spring is that monitoring these non-structural carbohydrate levels are incredibly difficult because they fluctuate throughout the day based on rates of photosynthesis. So because photosynthesis happens based off of sunlight, obviously photosynthesis is going to be greater during the day, which means that these products of photosynthesis are going to be highest in the afternoon, around 3 to 4 p.m. The sun's been up most of the day. That grass has been incredibly active. It's making all of its nutrients to make it through the evening when the sun's not out. And so the highest stores of those non-structural carbohydrates are going to be in the afternoon. And then overnight, those concentrations decrease because that grass is using those non-structural carbohydrates to make it through the night until the sun comes up again. It's also dependent on other environmental conditions. So whether it's a drought year, whether there's been a recent frost, changes in soil fertility, moisture, all of these different things play a role in the levels of non-structural carbohydrates in our cool season grasses during the spring months. So monitoring it is not really our best bet. Our best bet is just understanding that these non-structural carbohydrates are going to be highest in the afternoons, lowest overnight in the very early morning hours. So the best way to account for this is adjusting our management strategies. So how best do we do that? Well, the easiest way is to simply remove horses from that pasture during those peak times. And that can either be housing horses in a dry lot for all of the spring months, so we get through that period of greatest risk, and supplement those horses with hay instead of pasture grasses. But that's not always feasible, right? So a lot of times we feed hay during the winter months because there's either snow on the ground or the amount of forage in our pastures isn't great enough to meet nutrient requirements, so we supplement with hay. Now, once those grasses come up, horses are like, yes, we have access to grass. It tastes really good compared to this hay. We're going to mow it down. And that's what they do. And that increases risk a little bit as well. So a lot of times people will remove horses from pasture in the spring if there's a dry lot situation where the horses can still get adequate voluntary exercise. But what's actually becoming more common and a little bit easier from a management perspective is having dry lots available or stall time strategically placed during the day. So horses can be housed during those afternoon hours in a stall or in a dry lot, and then turnout can be allowed in the very early morning hours when those non-structural carbohydrate levels are significantly lower and of less risk of causing metabolic diseases in our horses. Now, in our high-risk horses that maybe already have some metabolic pathologies, insulin resistance, equine metabolic syndrome, laminitis also. Those will manage a little bit differently. We still want the benefits for those horses of grazing behavior, voluntary exercise, and so on. So our options for them are to also turn them out in the early morning hours, allowing that grazing behavior, allowing that voluntary exercise, which is so important from a behavioral perspective, but also just overall health. But with those horses, we can put something like a grazing muzzle on them. They're still able to take in some grasses, but their intake is going to be drastically reduced. So our risk of them consuming excessive levels of non-structural carbohydrates is greatly reduced. So most of what we do to combat the issues with cool season grasses in the spring is simply changing when we allow horses that turn out to pasture. And then when those non-structural carbohydrates are highest in the afternoon and early evening hours, then we take those horses away from that situation and even either put them in a stalled situation, or we move them over to a dry lot of some kind and then turn them back out in the early morning hours, either with or without a muzzle, depending on risk level of that horse. And then again, bring them back off as those non-structural carbohydrates start to increase. And those are our best management practices for horses. So we don't need to make it really complicated of having our pastures constantly tested for non-structural carbohydrate levels, or even necessarily pulling them off during the entire spring. It's just a matter of understanding how those grasses work from their own metabolism standpoint, and then what effects that could have on our horses. So in general, we don't need to fear grasses in the spring, but we do need to be aware that there is a little bit of increased risk associated with that, and maybe adjust our management strategies accordingly. But having just a basic understanding of how that grass grows, and also how our horses digest that and utilize those nutrients, drives what our management practices are going to be and can help you make better decisions moving forward. I hope you enjoyed this talk about our cool season grasses. And again, my name is Dr. Amanda Bradbury, Assistant Professor at Montana State University and Consulting Nutritionist for FullBucket Health. Feel free to check out our products online, and thank you for tuning in.